Testing, 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 testing.
Of Zimbabwe, the regime kept me chained on the hospital bed.
In North Korea, if you say bad word, I can go to jail.
In Iran, the most important thing that should be suppressed is the voice.
Autocracies. Do you hear this? Listen, it's the voices of the young people rising. It is the voices of the revolutionaries. It is the voices of freedom.
Libertad.
Rusununguko.
Azadi.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have the great honor to introduce our keynote speaker. For over 4 decades, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi has been a leader and advocate for the principles of freedom, democracy, and human rights for the people of Iran. He maintains constant contact with his compatriots and opposition groups, both inside and outside the country. The Crown Prince travels the world, meeting with heads of state, legislators, policymakers, interest groups, and student groups, speaking about the plight of Iranians under the Islamic regime. He consistently speaks out against the widespread abuse and oppression of the Iranian people, and he calls for the establishment of a secular democracy in Iran. He calls for regime change through non-violent civil disobedience and for a free and open referendum on a new government of Iran. According to yesterday's Die Welt newspaper, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi is considered the most prominent leader opposing the Islamic regime in Iran. As the Crown Prince has mentioned, his father, the Shah, was very close with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. In 1978, together with the leaders of the United States and Israel, President Sadat won the Nobel Peace Prize. After he bravely broke with decades of war, he flew to Jerusalem, he addressed the Israeli Knesset, and he negotiated the historic Camp David peace treaty. Sadly, a generation later today, war and terrorism persist across the Middle East, from the IRGC terrorist proxies in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Gaza, and from the head of the snake, the head of the octopus, the Islamic regime in Tehran. For years, many Western governments here in Europe and abroad kept saying, don't be too firm with the regime, it might provoke war. They said you need to appease the mullahs. That will bring peace. They made deals with the regime. They freed up billions of dollars, and we know where the money went to. We know the result. We did not get peace. We got the horrible regional war of the past year and a half. The Middle East and the world needs to see an end to this IRGC terrorism. Now, the Crown Prince has been very clear. He has called for maximum pressure on the regime and maximum support to the brave Iranian people. The Iranian Crown Prince has a clear vision for peace. Just as Sadat made the historic visit to Jerusalem in 1977, Reza Pahlavi made his own historic visit to Israel in April 2023, evoking the liberation granted by Cyrus the Great. From 2,500 years ago, the Crown Prince called for the good peoples of Iran and Israel to renew their ancient friendship. And most recently, in a letter sent to the US President by the Crown Prince on January 20th, he wrote, Mr. President, you have the opportunity to go beyond the groundbreaking Abraham Accords by helping to facilitate the Cyrus Accords, uniting Israel, Arab nations, and a free Iran, you can transform the Middle East and the world, said the Crown Prince. Ladies and gentlemen, I firmly believe that if the Crown Prince can achieve unity among all the good people of Iran who are opposing this evil regime, if he can unite Iranians with the other peoples of the world, whom we heard from today, who are fighting their own dictatorships, if he can bring the promise of peace and prosperity to the Middle East, I firmly believe that the Crown Prince, just like Anwar Sadat, can be the next winner of the Nobel Peace Prize and usher in a bright new future for all. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi.
Thank you so much. I love you too. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, and tireless advocates for human rights, before I begin, I would like to thank the thousands of my fellow compatriots who have come from all over the world to be here today to demonstrate their love for Iran and their commitment to its liberation. Being here in Geneva, the home of the United Nations Human Rights Council, makes it particularly special. I extend my sincere thanks to Dr. Noor and his team for making this conference a beacon of hope for oppressed voices worldwide. I stand here on behalf of my compatriots who have for far too long been silenced, not only by the tyrannical regime that occupies our country, but by the ideological bias that distorts the truth about Iran. The story of the Islamic Republic is one of deception. This deception, coupled with their own arrogant assumptions, led leaders in the West and many in the media to portray Khomeini as a saint. They painted the revolution as one of justice and freedom. What followed was nothing short of hell on earth. Even before taking power, Khomeini's movement showed its true face. The Cinema Rex arson in Abadan killed over 400 innocent people. It was a sign of what was to come. Once in power, the regime's first targets were Iran's most capable and patriotic citizens, military officers, business leaders, intellectuals, professionals, and public servants who had built a proud and modernizing nation. I knew many of them personally. Their murders were celebrated and even encouraged in revolutionary newspapers, while ignored in Western ones. Many of these men and women remain unknown to the world because they had no lobbyists or political sponsorship. Instead, they were buried in unmarked graves, and their families were denied even the dignity of mourning them. But their memory endures in the heart of those who continue their fight, and in the resolve of Iran's new generation. Thereafter, the regime turned its war against Iranian women. The progressive family protection law was the very first one Khomeini revoked. The mandatory hijab law, imposed shortly after the revolution, became a tool of subjugation, symbolizing the Islamic regime's obsession with the control over women's bodies and lives. However, from those very first days until today, Iranian women have been fighting back. But let me be clear, Iranian women are not just fighting against the forced hijab. Their struggle is not about a piece of cloth. It is about reclaiming their equality and their country. Brave women like Fatemeh Sepehri, Nasrin Shakarami, and Nahid Shirpishe continue to resist despite imprisonment, maltreatment, and relentless persecution. Yet I see that their names remain unfamiliar to some in this room. Why? Because some human rights organizations have allowed political bias and ideological preferences to determine which voices are amplified and which are silenced. This is unethical and unacceptable. All those fighting for a secular, democratic Iran deserve recognition, regardless of their background or political affiliations. I am glad that the Geneva summit is acting in that spirit, and I am thankful to them for hosting several of Iran's bravest protesters and their families here with us today. Thank you, Nazanin Afshinjam, for facilitating their presence, and the Geneva summit for hosting them. Just as the Islamic Republic's repression has targeted those of all ideologies, it has targeted those of all faiths. The Baha'is have been systematically persecuted, their leaders imprisoned, their cemeteries desecrated, and their youth denied education. Christians, particularly converts from Islam, live in constant fear. Like their Christian compatriots, Sunni Muslims, Jews, Sufis, Zoroastrians face rampant restriction and discrimination. The regime's institutionalized antagonism with any diversity, including religious diversity, has threatened centuries of coexistence and unity, unique to Iran. The regime's war on cultural heritage has also extended to targeting Iran's pre-Islamic history. Sites like Persepolis and Pasargad, symbols of Iran's ancient civilization, are decaying under neglect, and access to these sites is often blocked by the regime. By attempting to erase these symbols of national identity, the enemies of Iran seek to rewrite history and deprive Iranians of their rich heritage. Even the creative souls of Iran are not safe. Musicians, artists, poets, who are the very heart of Iran's culture, risk the death sentence for daring to express themselves. The Islamic Republic's war on all strata of Iranian society has targeted communities across our nation, across provincial, linguistic, and tribal lines. But despite all its attempts, it shall not divide it. We are not just fighting against the Islamic Republic, we are fighting for Iran. So let me be clear, we will never, ever allow our nation to be divided. We see this on the streets of cities across Iran as a nation has risen in unity. The protests of 2017 and 2019 marked a fundamental shift. Iranians no longer chanted for reform. They demanded the end of the Islamic Republic. A decade after the Green Movement sought to reclaim its stolen votes, the generation of 2017 and 2019 is fighting to reclaim its stolen country. And they have paid a heavy price. In November 2019, the regime massacred over 1,500 protesters, many shot at close range. Thousands were arrested, tortured, or just disappeared. Then came the Women Life Freedom Uprising in 2022, ignited by the murder of Mahsa Amini. The regime and its apologists tried to frame the movement along ethnic lines, but Mahsa's own mother called her daughter the daughter of Iran. Protesters responded by chanting, "From Zahedan to Kurdistan, I give my life for Iran." This is the voice of a united nation. Despite brutal crackdowns and internet blackouts, the resistance continues. Manouchehr Bakhtiari, who lost his son Puya in the protests, remains relentless in his fight for justice from inside his jail cell. His courage embodies the spirit of a people who refuse to be broken. But the Islamic Republic's crime does not stop at Iran's borders. The regime uses its embassies and so-called cultural centers as a base for espionage and terrorism across Europe. When it cannot reach dissidents abroad, it takes foreign citizens hostage inside Iran, holding them for ransom in a game of political blackmail. These are the crimes the world knows about. But there are many more, often overlooked, such as the regime's destruction of Iran's environment. I consider environmental justice as one of my compatriots' human rights. Decades of corruption and mismanagement have created ecological disasters that threaten millions. Lake Urumie, once the largest saltwater lake in the Middle East, has nearly vanished, triggering salt storm that devastates farmlands and causes respiratory illnesses. Rivers like Zayanderud have dried up, leaving farmers without water. In Khuzestan, where water flowed for centuries, water shortages have led to repeated protests, each brutally suppressed. Air pollution in Tehran and Ahvaz is among the worst in the world, often reaching toxic levels, forcing schools and business closures. And those who dare to speak out, environmentalists like Kavuz Sayed Emami, are imprisoned or murdered. Meanwhile, a country that sits on the world's second largest gas reserves experiences nationwide blackouts. Patients die in hospitals, businesses collapse, and families are left in darkness. Even the most basic of necessities, including food to eat, has become luxuries available to the privileged few. In what should be one of the world's richest countries, a growing number of my compatriots can barely afford to buy bread, let alone meat. This is all the consequences of a regime that loots and pillages rather than govern. But what is caused by the Islamic Republic can be solved by its removal. Today, we are presented with a historic opportunity. The regime is weaker than it has ever been. Its axis of resistance has been dismantled, and its domestic legitimacy has evaporated. Now is the time to act. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Therefore, at the call of my fellow Iranians, I am stepping forward to lead this movement and transition, not for myself, not for posts or power, but to answer the call and do my duty as a patriot. Thank you. Thank you. My strategy for dismantling this regime and rebuilding Iran is clear. Mobilizing grassroots networks inside Iran, uniting the diaspora, pressuring G20 governments to impose maximum pressure on the regime while providing maximum support to the people, splitting the regime and encouraging defections, and preparing for political stabilization, democratic elections, and Iran's economic development and reconstruction. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I bring you a message from a nation in chains. The Iranian people have endured more than 4 decades of suffering, yet their spirit remains unbroken. They are fighting not just for themselves. They are not fighting not just for themselves, but for the values of freedom, justice, and human dignity. This is not just about my nation's survival. It is also about international stability and global peace. For as we have seen just in the last week, from terrorist attacks to hostage-taking, the Islamic Republic, despite its rhetoric in Davos and calls for a new deal, is still waging war on the free world. Until it is toppled, it will not stop. As I have traveled the continent for the past 2 weeks, I have spoken with government leaders of all parties and stripes. I know Iranians and their democratic cause has many friends in Europe, and that number is growing. But to those who seek to silence us or stand in our way, I say, we are not waiting for your green lights. The Iranian people do not ask for your pity. They ask for your partnership. Our question is, will you stand with us? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin the next panel, I just want to thank the Crown Prince for his powerful and inspiring message, which gives hope to all of us. In a moment, we will hear from a panel of Iranian survivors, very courageous people, to be chaired by our longtime partner, the international human rights activist, Nazanin Afshinjam. Thank you very much.
I would like to express my deep gratitude to Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi for his powerful words, shedding light on the Iranian people's struggle for democracy. I truly believe that only through unity, embracing a plurality of voices, and bound by our shared mission to overthrow the brutal regime, can we pave the way for free, secular, and democratic Iran, realized through a referendum and free and fair elections. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, human rights defenders, and courageous survivors. Before coming here, my son asked me, "Mom, where are you going?" And I said to him, "Disneyland." And he said, "Disneyland? How come you're not taking us?" And I said, "I'm going to Geneva." He said, "I didn't know there's a Disneyland in Geneva." And I said, "Well, it's a kind of a Disneyland for human rights defenders. We have a slew of very interesting characters, the heroes of our time. We go on several rides, emotional rides, and at the end, after consuming so much, after we've tasted that sweet cotton candy, we don't know if we're leaving feeling like we've have that taste of solidarity, or whether we feel sick from the inaction of the international community." He rolled his eyes, of course, and asked me when we're actually going to Disneyland. It is a true pleasure to be here and to witness the incredible journey of the Geneva Summit over the years. As I said earlier, I had the pleasure of chairing the first summit about 16 years ago, and I continue to marvel at the vital platform that this summit provides human rights defenders and survivors. While we may not always feel heard in institutions such as the United Nations and under other international fora, where tragically our oppressors are too often given the stage, we can count on the Geneva Summit as a place where truth prevails and where we can unite under a shared commitment to justice, freedom, and human dignity. It is in this spirit I am honored today to introduce 3 Iranians who recently escaped Iran with deeply personal and courageous stories. As you all heard, for more than 4 decades, the people of Iran have endured relentless repression under the rules of Ayatollah Khamenei and its oppressive IRGC forces. Their regime not only commits atrocities under the veiled guise of ideology and religion, but does so with an inexplicable layer of evil and cruelty. Let history note that this regime not only silences dissent by arresting peaceful protesters, but arrests the lawyers defending them or representing them and the journalists reporting them. Not only executes political prisoners, but arrests and harasses the family members that are trying to mourn them. Not only discriminates against ethnic and other marginalized groups like the LGBTQ community, but deliberately hunts them and targets them. And not only persecutes religious minorities like the Baha'is, who are denied access to higher education and certain professions, but goes so far as desecrating their graves in an attempt to erase them. And not only arrests and beat women for not properly wearing the hijab, but rape them in the process as a tool of repression. Let's not forget when the morality police brutally beat Jina Mahsa Amini for not properly wearing the hijab. It ignited the woman life freedom revolutionary movement, the powerful uprising where millions of people came out onto the streets, not just demanding reform, but calling for a complete overthrow of the regime. Their courage came at an immense cost. In just a few months of peaceful protests, 600 people were killed, including 68 children. Over 20,000 people were arrested, and hundreds were injured or blinded. This does not even include the 900 people that were executed in Iran last year alone, making it the country with the highest number of executions of women and children in the world. The UN's fact-finding mission report on Iran last year not only found that this regime had committed egregious human rights abuses and systematic oppression of women's rights, but it concluded that it had committed crimes against humanity. But despite the brutality, the Iranian people have never surrendered their fight for freedom. From Friday protests in Balochistan, the workers in Khuzestan, the widespread strikes in Kurdistan, and teachers in Esfahan, to the prisons of Evin in Tehran, including many students, talented artists, advocates, including a Nobel Peace Laureate. These are the real heroic voices of Iran, and they cannot be silenced. Shortly, we will hear from 3 ordinary Iranians with extraordinary courage, those who have risked everything, not just for their own rights, but for the generations to come. They fight so that no child is forced to scavenge for food in dumpsters, no youth is indoctrinated in the Basiji forces to repress their own people, and no citizen must live in fear of their own government. They stood up so that one day Iranians can enjoy the simple freedoms that make life worth living, like walking your dog without fear of your pet being confiscated and killed, breathing clean air without the suffocating pollution, having access to water, a soon-to-be luxury with the drying up of the lakes, holding their loved ones' hands, or dancing or singing in the streets without fear of arrest. Their struggle is for a future where dignity, joy, and freedom are not crimes, but basic human rights. And that is why we are here. This summit is not just a platform for discussion, it is a call to action. The Iranian regime thrives on the world's silence and appeasement, but silence and compliance are actually complicity. It was this silence that resulted in the torture and death in custody of German national and hostage Jamshid Sharmad. His daughter was at this summit a few years ago pleading for his life. It is our duty as free nations, as human rights advocates, and as defenders of democracy to amplify the cries of the oppressed and hold the oppressors accountable for their actions in our own countries through universal jurisdiction or at the International Criminal Court. Sanctions, like Magnitsky sanctions, must be enforced and not just discussed. Western liberal democracies must follow Canada and the United States in designating the IRGC on the terrorist list and closing the embassies. Having diplomatic relations with tyrants must come at a cost. And to those who argue that diplomacy requires engagement, let me be clear. There is no truth, accountability, or negotiating with a regime that executes children despite the fact that they've signed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which forbid it. What makes you think that the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the world will comply with a second nuclear deal? Let me ask another rhetorical question. Would you be willing to meet, shake hands, or do trade deals with someone who segregated people based on their skin color? Beginning in the 1960s, the world took a firm stance against racial apartheid in South Africa, making it clear that such injustice would not be tolerated. Why then has the global community failed to unite in condemning the Iranian regime for its systemic oppression of women, where the law places the life of a woman as half a man under the law? This form of apartheid, gender apartheid, is just as insidious and must be denounced with the same unwavering resolve. And lastly, why are free nations allowing regime officials to enter their borders with their dirty, laundered money, but accept so few deserving refugees? Bona fide Iranian refugees with UNHCR status are being deported back to Iran from Turkey at great risk of severe consequences. We must stop legitimizing the small group of Islamist tyrants ruling close to 90 million people they do not represent and unleashing terror through their proxies. I say this not just for the safety and security of Iranians, but for the world entire. Today, you will hear from individuals who have lived through the horrors of the Islamic Republic's oppression and have recently escaped. These are not just stories, they are testimonies of resilience, proof of the regime's crimes, and a reminder of why our fight must continue. Let us listen, let us open our hearts and bear witness, and most importantly, let us act. At this time, I would ask you to please put on your headsets if you cannot understand Persian. In 1979, at the start of the Islamic Revolution, my own father was imprisoned, tortured, and almost executed by the Revolutionary Guards. And every time I see his scars, it renews my spirit and my resolve to do my duty, which I feel is to bring the true heroic voices of survivors, like the three that are sitting here today, to international fora so that their voices sit in the hearts of the journalists and diplomats and policymakers here and hopefully force them to act. First, we will hear from Mahan Mehrabi. She is the sister of political prisoner Mahmoud Mehrabi, who was sentenced to death for his activism on social media. Now she's not only fights for justice for her brother, but amplifies the voices of the oppressed in Iran. Mahan, please, could you take the microphone?
Greetings to all. Greetings to the Prince of Iran. Greetings to my people. With all, I would like to thank the Prince of Iran, the next King of Iran. With all my hopes, sorrow, and the love I carry in my heart, I speak to you. I am the sister of Mahmoud Mehrabi, a political prisoner whose life is in grave danger. How can one put into words a pain that takes root in the hearts of thousands of families each day? How can one describe a wound that is etched not only on the body and soul of the brother, my sister, and my family, but on the very body and soul of my homeland? Mahmoud Mehrabi, my brother who lives a life of courage, believes in freedom, and exemplifies independent thought, has been met with the cold walls of prison, torture, solitary confinement, and a death sentence, nightmares that have become a terrifying reality. But this is not just the story of one family. This is the story of thousands of families whose loved ones are imprisoned. Fathers, mothers, children, and sisters who live each day in unbearable agony, with their hearts pounding, clinging to hope, yearning for the moment they will see their loved ones once again, all while burning in the torment of awaiting their loved one's verdict. Do you see how my hair has turned white? It turned white overnight, the moment that I received the news of my brother's death sentence. Look at the deep wrinkles of my face. These are the scars of my unbearable pain, etched by the immense suffering inflicted upon my brother and my family. I left my ancient homeland, Iran, and came here for a sip of freedom. I come from a land of kindness where I come from a land of kindness where dictators extinguish hope. My homeland is wounded, torn apart by the crimes of a dangerous extremist minority that is not just a threat to Iran, but to the entire world. And we know that you know, and your governments are well aware of every crime, you who are the representatives of a democratic and free world. I want to share with you the profound pain that has gripped the souls of my people. Listen just once, this time for the sake of freedom, for the sake of humanity, for the sake of life. Listen to the voices of Iran's mothers and fathers. Watch how their beloved children are killed, tortured, blind, raped, and forcibly disappeared. My outcry is for the 1,500 Iranians who were shot in silence within 3 days during Bloody November. Look at the fathers and the mothers who have spent years in prison merely for demanding freedom. Can you bear living a life where you never see your children grow up? Would you be able to endure the torture and rape of your sons and daughters? Can you imagine a life where you wake up every single day to the darkness of blindness inflicted by your government? Have you ever witnessed the execution of your loved one? If you have not, then ask your governments to stop supporting these dictators. Ask them to stop seeking benefits in the torture, blood, and death of my people. I am from Iran, where Zara Ismaili, a street singer, has been imprisoned for months merely for being a woman and for singing. Where Fatima Seperi, a brave woman with heart disease, is deprived of freedom. Where Mashallah Karami, Nahid Shirpishe, and Manucher Bakhtiari are imprisoned for simply demanding their rights. And where there are thousands upon thousands of other innocent prisoners. And in Iran, my rich homeland is today impoverished because its wealth is spent on fueling wars and extremism in the region. Its people do not even have clean air to breathe. Iran is wounded. Its people are starving, not just from economic poverty, but from the poverty of justice, poverty of freedom, and poverty of humanity. And yet the governments of so-called democratic nations are sitting and watching. They share a table with this regime. They shake their blood-stained hands. With those who oppress, they smile. But I ask you, is this justice? Is this humanity? We do not want mere expressions of concern. Instead of offering concern this time, take action. Use all your power. In the name of all grieving mothers, in the name of political and ideological prisoners, in the name of all the daughters and sons of my homeland who perish in the silence of the world, I urge you to see the people of Iran. To not close your eyes to these crimes. You have the opportunity to be a voice for freedom. Do not allow history to place you alongside the oppressors. This oppression will come to an end, and when it does, do not give future generations a reason to accuse you of silence and inaction. Iran bleeds, yet it remains alive. Iran suffers, but it continues to fight. And we will continue to stand for its freedom until our very last breath. Listen, what you hear from me is a last glimpse of hope from a suffering land burdened with injustices. This is the voice of Iran, where our backs are broken, but we stand tall in dignity. Stand with us, hear our voices, so when freedom comes in a world that has lost its humanity, you will be remembered for upholding dignity and justice. Tomorrow belongs to us. Tell me, where will you stand in history? Madam Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, I have a question. Where do you stand in history? Alongside the people of Iran or alongside the Islamic Republic? Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mahan John, for your very heartfelt words. Next, we will hear from Maryam Dior. She is the mother of 16-year-old Abolfazl Amir Atai, who was shot at close range in the left side of his head with tear gas during the peaceful protests. He suffered catastrophic brain damage and paralysis. For months, he was in hospital before tragically succumbing to his injuries. Maryam John, will you please take the stage?
Salutations to the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. On September 16th, 2022, the Islamic Republic killed a young woman named Mahsa Amini over the hijab. People took to the streets empty-handed to protest the regime. But the Islamic Republic welcomed them with live ammunition and weapons. On the morning of September 21st, my son shared a story on Instagram in protest. Later that day, he went into the streets. That afternoon, forces of the Islamic Republic brutally shot my 16-year-old son in the head with tear gas at a close range. I am Maryam, the mother of Abolfazl Amir Atai, a brave boy who refused to remain silent in the face of injustice and who stood alongside the people. But they shot my son with a military-grade weapon. People ended up carrying Abolfazl drenched in blood to the hospital. My son was alive for 8.5 months. For a month and a half, they refused to allow me into the hospital. He was in the ICU for 3 months. After that, I stayed by his side in the post-ICU ward for 55 days. I finally brought him home, where he stayed for 2.5 months. I then returned him to the hospital for another surgery, and 20 days later, he passed away. His father Mohsen, his younger brother Ashia, and I died and came back to life every single day and every single moment of those 8.5 months as we watched Abolfaz's fade before our eyes. We had to give Abolfaz hope while enduring relentless pressure and threats from varying forces of the Islamic Republic. Abolfaz teetered between life and death, enduring pain beyond words. My beautiful, brave son had become completely paralyzed. His eyes fixed on the ceiling, his body motionless. When I held him in my arms and kissed him, his frail, cachectic, helpless body shattered my heart. Pain consumed my entire soul, but for my son, I had to stay strong. For 8.5 months, after 8.5 months of pain, suffering and fighting for his dear life, my son passed away. His burial was like a battlefield. Excuse me. His burial was like a battlefield with armored vehicles, armed motorcyclists, and an army of regime forces surrounding us. And with consistent threats to remain silent, we completed my son's burial. For the last time I held his cold body in my arms and whispered a vow in his ear that the world would know what they had done to him. I laid my headscarf under his head and buried him. From the very first day, we were under pressure and threats from every branch of the Islamic Republic. They wouldn't allow us to hold a ceremony. They tried to force us into silence. But I was no longer just a mother. I had to be the voice of a child whom they had murdered. I hid my tears, swallowed my pain, and cried out. I had to fight so that everyone would know what they had done to my son. He gave up his life in pursuit of justice, and now I must walk in his path. And so I began my activism. I began sharing photos and videos of my son's bitter days as they were evidence of the Islamic Republic's crimes. The regime escalated its threats, but I grew stronger with each day's passing because my son's innocent eyes never left my mind. I never surrendered to their threats. But when they targeted my younger son, made specific demands of me, and nearly killed me in a staged car accident, I decided to flee Iran. I decided to be the voice of my son and all the children of my homeland who have been killed.
فرزندان کشته شده وطنم باشم.
Now I appear before you to speak about the Islamic Republic. For years, the Islamic Republic has slaughtered our children for any reason or none at all. The children of my homeland are murdered by military-grade weapons and execution by hanging. Many have been blinded at their hands. The people of my land have been held captive under the grip of the Islamic Republic, their voices silenced and unheard, because in my country, the judge and executioner are one and the same. After killing our children, the Islamic Republic forces families into silence by threatening the lives of their loved ones. I, Maryam, mother of Abul Faz, stand here today not just for Abul Faz. I stand before you for all the innocent children who have been killed, for the thousands of young Iranians awaiting execution, for the grieving parents who long for justice, and for the fathers and mothers who are imprisoned simply for demanding their rights and who are silenced by the regime. For the dear, defenseless people of my country living under the shadows of oppression, who are still breathing, but in whom hope will not die, I say this. My fellow sisters and brothers, you are not alone. Stop the massacre of the Islamic Republic. See the people of my homeland. Hear them. They are imprisoned in the shadows of oppression, behind the walls of the Islamic Republic's persecution, bound by the chains of dictatorship. Wounded yet hopeful souls remain. Please help them, because your silence only tightens those chains. Please be the voice of my people. Stand with them. With the hope of a free and prosperous Iran, with the support of Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. Long live Iran.
Thank you very much, Maryam. There is no greater pain in the world than a mother losing a child, so we know this was very difficult to share your story, but we really appreciate it. And they tried to silence you, but they didn't, and you're here, and these deaths will not be in vain. I came to know the next speaker intimately, reading page after page of his story and medical ordeals, when my friend from Canada, Ziba, had compiled his story and made a file, hoping we could help get him asylum. So it's very emotional and heartfelt that I see him here sitting next to me today, and we're so happy to see you on free soil, Saman. Saman Pourmahdi was participating in one of the peaceful protests when the regime forces shot him in the eye, causing the permanent loss of his left eye. Thank you for your sacrifice, Saman, and we would love to hear your story.
درود بر همه هموطنان عزیزم.
Hello to all my compatriots.
درد هموطنان از درد خودم صحبت بکنم که بی ارزش جلوی از دست دادن عزیزانه. Hello everyone. I'm honored to have this opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Saman Pourmahdi. I'm 32 years old. And in 2022, Iranian security forces shot and permanently blinded me in my left eye. I knew our country was rich in natural resources and wealth, but every day I saw a different reality. Small children searching the trash for food, elderly men and women dying because they couldn't afford hospital bills, teenagers and students arrested, tortured, and killed just for protesting the regime mismanagement and corruption. How can a nation with so much oil, gas, and wealth have millions living in poverty? That's why I have always been against the Islamic Republic, and why I joined the protests in 2022 after the regime brutally murdered Mahsa Amini just for not wearing her hijab properly. My opposition to this regime did not start in 2022. For more than a decade, I actively spoke out against the Islamic Republic. Since 2012, I have been writing against the regime on Facebook and Instagram. For 13 years, I participated in a street protest. I stood alongside the people in 4 major uprisings. On the night of October 1st, I planned to join the protest at Vali Asr Square in Tehran. I was standing on my motorcycle, looking through the crowds, when I spotted a security officer from previous protest. He was just 2 meters away. And he recognized me too, because he raised his gun, and in an stance, he shot me directly in my eye. I could barely see. Blood gushed out of my eye. But I sped away on my motorcycle and escaped to the hospital. While I waited for the doctor, I took a video of my face, blood pouring down my face, and posted it to Instagram. I was the first person to expose the regime for targeting protesters' eyes. But I needed everyone to understand what the regime was capable of and why we were protesting. I knew it was risky to post the video. It was risky just to be a hospital. I'd heard stories of security forces dragging injured protesters away from their hospital beds. But at the same time, I desperately wanted to doctors save my eyesight if they could. So I waited. But then, in secret, a brave nurse warned me that the hospital had already tipped off security forces to my bed, number 25. I had no choice. I feared for my life. So the first second I was alone, I left my bed and found the consultation room to hide. Eventually, I slipped out through a courtyard and ran away from the hospital. For a few days, I couldn't return home. I left everything behind. And just 14 days after they shot me, I fled Iran. But my loss is nothing compared to the suffering of millions of Iranians. Some people try to frame Iran's struggles as only about compulsory hijab or gender equality. But this is just a part of thousands of problems we face every day in Iran. I want to make one thing clear. The people of Iran do not recognize the Islamic Republic as their legitimate government. This regime does not represent us. To the international community, I ask, cut all diplomatic ties with the Islamic Republic. Take immediate action to free all political prisoners and put maximum pressure on the regime to stop the executions. Because this is our most important demand. The Islamic Republic must fall. The fall of Islamic Republic is not only necessary for the people of Iran, it's essential for global peace and security. This dictatorship, with its support for terrorism and regional instability, is a threat to the entire world. But there is a hope. Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi is the true voice of the Iranian people. He carries the hope, vision, and unity needed to rebuild our country. Together, we will build a free Iran, a nation where its people can finally live with dignity, justice, and peace. We are a great nation. We will take back Iran. ما ملت کبیریم. ایران رو پس میگیریم. Thank you so much.
Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for your powerful words, Saman. Their suffering is not a statistic. Their pain is not a political tool. Their voices are the heartbeat of a revolution that will not be stopped. Thank you for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, for the next speech, interpretation is available in English and French. Headphones can be found on the tables or next to the chairs. Please select your preferred language. Channel 1 for English, Channel 2 for French. Thank you.